Just to reply to some of the things that Laurie was saying, there is actually a real condition called legal abuse syndrome. It's a form of PTSD that often litigants have. They get if they have to appear before court over and over and over and over again to defend themselves on things that are completely unfounded, completely false accusation. And we see this a lot of times with people who have restraining orders or other protective orders. That abuser cannot contact them at all, but they can call them into court and summon them to court, pro se, cross-examine that victim in a courtroom, ask them about their sex life, ask them about very personal private information, and under oath that victim has to answer. So we definitely have some things that need to be fixed with our system. When I've gone to universities and colleges and I speak specifically about the topic that you have spoken about, we have a lot of students who are very surprised to know that when you are a victim of domestic violence, you don't get a lawyer. One is not appointed to you, especially if you are trying to protect your children. And just because you may get a protective order and doesn't mean that your children are protected from the abuser. And so we see a lot of victims fall on the sword because they're protecting their children, and they will intentionally put themselves into harm's way, just as the abuser attended, because they're trying to protect their children. And so they will have to go outside those bounds. Another thing that is not usually talked about is you don't get a jury. There is not a jury when you are in family court. And so it's basically what that judge decides. And a lot of times, another thing people don't know is that lawyers and the like can donate to the judge's campaign funds and have these business relationships with the judges that make it so you don't have a fair trial. And victims of domestic violence are highly at a disadvantage in a courtroom, because not only does she look like her finger was in a light socket and he looks like the perfect parent, but in a domestic violence relationship, who controls the money? Who can afford the lawyer? Who can afford the dream team? I'll tell you what, it's not the victim. And so we definitely have some holes in our system here. I wanted to go over a couple of statistics, kind of shifting away from the courtroom setting, but talking more about, in general, child abuse and abusers. A lot of times, since I also work on an anti-human trafficking task force, and I do cyber intelligence for various organizations, and a lot of times I get to go in and interview the perpetrators of abuse, and 95% of the time they are men. And so if I start saying he, it's not because men are generally more dishonest than women, or it has nothing to do with that. I think that it's just the majority are men due to social, cultural, and even some biological factors that they just, generally the perpetrators are not that men are generally perpetrators, that perpetrators are generally the men in most of these cases. In fact, it's only about 10% of our population who are abusive. And however, with that 10% of our population, we have 25% of women being victimized and 1 in 4 or 1 in 6 boys. In the state of Oregon, however, it's different here. In the state of Oregon, this was part of the Count Her In study. It found that over 1 million women and girls have been victimized. That is 1 in 2. That's not 1 in 4. That is 50% of the female population in the state of Oregon has been a victim of physical or sexual violence. We're talking about young girls and grown women sometime in their lifetime. We are also seeing that from the FBI statistics a couple years ago when I would do these presentations, I was telling people we are the 3rd most dangerous state to be a woman in. As of 2019, at the beginning of the year, when I checked the FBI statistics for 2018, we are now the 2nd most dangerous state to be a woman in. And so just having that awareness that if you are living inside this bubble, thinking that Oregon is this great human rights liberal state, I just popped your bubble right there. And we just need to have that kind of awareness that these things are happening all around us. Touching just a tiny bit on custody, every year throughout the United States, we have 58,000 children every year sent to live with their abuser, not because the victim parent, whether it's the mom or the dad, not because that victim parent is a bad parent, but because they were out-lawyered and outmaneuvered in a system that is not educated on what abuse and violence looks like. So when I have talked with these abusers and sat down and had candid conversations with them about why they do what they do, and when people find out what I do, they often, especially the mothers with the young children under their arms, they say, so what does a bad guy look like? And I'll tell you what a bad guy looks like, okay? There's a couple different kinds of bad guys, what they look like. You could have a bad guy that looks like, it's almost like a predator looking at you. It's something almost not human, that coldness in their eyes, and you just feel cold when you walk into the room with them, and their conversations are without empathy, without emotion, and so there's that kind where you just know, there's that instinctual part of you that knows to be afraid. And then there are the predators that look like your minister, your coach, your teacher, your grandma, those kind of predators. And we call those the pillar of the community type predators. And it is the perfect place to hide in plain sight. And an example of a predator would be like Bill Cosby, where I grew up, my parents talking wonderful things about him. Look what he does for the community. Look at all the great family values he's teaching. Look at all the money he donates, and look at all this. But then we find out years later there's a long line of victims that have been terrorized. And I believe that's, especially for children, a very hard thing to understand, is that their thinking is very black and white. You're either a good guy or a bad guy. So how can a good guy do something so bad? And I think that even as adults, we sometimes have a hard time with that concept of how can someone so good be a bad guy? How can somebody who does good things also do really bad things? Well, you know what, that's just part of human nature. I want to briefly go over a couple of things that I have found when I have worked with, throughout my years working with victims of various types of crimes, what can be done to help them. From my understanding, a lot of this School of Technology, you're going to be either teaching or working in some kind of a technological field. Children, when you work with them as a teacher, a lot of times you're spending more time with them as a teacher in a classroom than their parents spend with them. You're going to be with them for 6 or 8 hours a day, and they're going to want to start to develop a relationship of trust with you. And I guarantee you, someday a child's going to come to you and say, this happened. Something happened to me, and I want to talk to you about it because you are one of my 5. I always tell when I talk to parents, I say, you got to have your children have their 5. They're 5 grown-ups that they can trust. And I say 5 because sometimes maybe one of those 5 ends up being the perpetrator. So if they have 5 grown-ups that they can go to, a lot of times if you're a teacher, you're going to fall into one of those 5 just because of the amount of time that you spend with children. And so when you have somebody come and say, something bad has happened to me, you need to know how to react. And the proper protocol, depending on the organization that you work with. As a teacher, you will be a mandated reporter, and you will need to be able to handle this and also be an appropriate support for the people that you serve. The first thing, stay calm. Say thank you. Thank you for telling me. Thank you so much. for trusting me. And I don't care if this is your child or your roommate or a student that comes to you and says this, say thank you for trusting me, for telling me this. Another thing that you need to make sure you don't do is should on them. Don't should on them at all. Don't say you should have run away. You should have never gone over to that place. Why didn't you run? Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you fight back? Those kind of things, that is a form of victim blaming and victim shaming, and we do not want to do any of that at all.
One of the things I think is very important to also say is I believe you.
I believe you. I believe you. Children will lie to get out of trouble, not to get into trouble, and it's more likely that a child will recant what they have said when they start to see how disruptive this has become. Maybe it leads to a divorce of their parents. Maybe it leads to them having to move to a new town or having to leave school. They may recant that abuse, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. So remember, children lie. That was one of the first things that I was taught when I started being trained in human trafficking. Children lie to get out of trouble, not into trouble. Create a loving, enriching, supporting environment for that victim as much as you can, depending on the appropriate role, whether it's you're a teacher or a roommate or a parent, so that if you do have a child that's being abused, that you have some kind of a stewardship over, that they will feel jarred coming from a toxic environment into a loving environment. They're going to know, I feel different when I'm here being loved rather than in this, and just giving them that kind of environment, knowing that there's something better out there. Stay active in kids' lives. Don't tolerate abuse of any kind. Just don't tolerate it. Don't say, oh, that's in their marriage, that's just between them, I'm going to stay out of this. Or start to ask questions, be curious. You may be able to help somebody. Always believe them. You already got that one. If it's appropriate, depending on your role with a child, talk to them about boundaries. Boundaries is a really important thing. Most abusers, when we talk to children about children who are in recovery, we talk to them about a fog. And this fog, whenever their mind starts to feel foggy, are you being manipulated by fear, obligation, or guilt? So that's the FOG, that's the acronym for FOG, is fear, obligation, and guilt. And sometimes we call this the spider sense, when you start to feel danger, or the oh feeling, or the fog if someone's talking to you or somebody's trying to get you to do something that you are just not comfortable doing. Are they using these tactics of fear, obligation, or guilt? The question is, as I will be teaching, how can you tell when there's domestic abuse versus a child reacting to the divorce because they're angry or frustrated? What are some signs of abuse? It is very normal for a child to have behavior problems when there is transition in a home, especially if it's going to be a sad transition. Some signs of abuse, and it's different depending on the type of abuse. If we start to see low self-esteem, okay, a child having either physical or emotional self-harm, if they start cutting themselves, that is a red flag, and that needs to be assessed by a professional to be able to determine, is this a child just going through, when people start cutting themselves, that's a cry for help. We got to figure out, what are they crying for help for? If we start seeing behavior problems, that can also be an indicator of a cry for help. What are they crying out for help for? Is it that they don't have a physical need being met, or an emotional need, or are they being damaged in some way and they just don't know how to express that something bad is happening to them, and so they are self-sabotaging and self-harming in some way? If there are physical abuse is often more easy to identify, because we will see a lot of And I'm not saying that kids don't get hurt. Kids break their arms. Kids get hurt. Kids, they have bruises all over their legs all the time because they're jumping off stuff and being rough. And so it's not if you see a bruise that kid's being abused. But if they start to lie to you about what happened, okay? If their story is not straight, if they tell you one day they broke their arm because they fell down the stairs and the next day it's because they were playing soccer, then that is a cause for concern. A lot of times with children who are being sexually abused, we see the isolation part of it, but we also see that they sometimes will start to act out in inappropriate sexual behaviors or having inappropriate trying to seek out those encounters with other students or speaking about those kinds of things. So it's not just, I guess like this book says, no visible bruises. There's other signs, and I would say that if you have a concern, then it would not be a bad thing to ask if they'd be willing just to go talk to somebody, or just spending some extra time, seeing if. One of the things that's really important is building that trust, and doing it while children are small, especially if you're a parent and you are able to be with a child or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle, talking to them when they're small about the cool stick they found or something they built out of Legos, because if they know that they can trust you and talk to you about these small things in their lives, as they get bigger and their problems get bigger, they know that they can trust you with those big things as well. Any suggestions for how to begin to challenge the current family court system? What else is the most dangerous state for the woman to be in? The state that's number one is Alaska. So that's number one, because I know that is one that people, they always say, well, what's number one then? What can be worse than here? And I just think that part of it is they need more work, just like us. We just need some more public awareness. Being a victim, whether you're a child victim or a victim of teen violence or cyberbullying, there's three common things that I have found between all victims and abusers. Isolation. Whether it is social isolation or physical isolation or emotional, that there is isolation. That abuser will isolate their victim. The other thing that we find in all abuse, and it doesn't matter if it's financial abuse or physical abuse, all of this abuse is about, or it could even be legal abuse. It's about power and control. It's about maintaining that power and control. An example is there was a case that the police were called out to a house for a domestic disturbance. When they got in the house, nobody was hurt. There were some people that were upset, but nobody was hurt. And as the police were getting people's statements and, did he hit you? No, he never hit me. The police was leaving and they noticed these holes in the wall down the hallway. And the officer said, what happened here? And then she said, well, every time I do something he doesn't like, he punches a hole in the wall and he says, next time that's your face. And so every time she walked down the hall to go to her bedroom or to take care of her children, and he wouldn't allow her to fix it and he wouldn't fix it himself, she would know, next time that's my face. Next time that's my face. It was never about hitting, okay? It's, in fact, a perpetrator of physical violence only has to, usually hit a couple of times in order to put in that fear that they will be hurt if the abuser is not able to maintain that power and control. I am a firm believer in accountability and I believe in the law, you know, for the people, by the people, and by the people that we elect that do work to create laws, and by the people who vote on these laws. We have a lot of great laws that protect people protect children from having to ever go to custody of abusers. If there's any domestic violence whatsoever, according to our law in the state of Oregon, and even our federal law, it says that abuser should never get custody, ever. But is that law being followed? So we obviously have some work to do, and part of that work is what we're doing here, and that's coming and speaking with all of you and helping to educate about prevention.